Story number 1. Last Halloween, a group of 5 friends and I decided to visit the graveyard where our old friend Jake was buried after his tragic car accident. It was around midnight and the air was crisp with the chill of approaching winter. We wanted to honor his memory by sharing stories and reminiscing about the good times we had with him. The graveyard, known locally as Old Willow, was a place we often passed by but never ventured into after dark. As we stood around Jake's grave, each of us took turns recounting funny and heartfelt moments. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying sense of loss that hung over us. The moonlight cast long shadows between the tombstones, adding an eerie ambiance to our gathering. Suddenly, I heard a faint, wavering voice of an elderly woman. At first, I thought one of my friends might be trying to startle the group, but the voice seemed distant and real, echoing softly through the still night. One of my friends, Mike, broke the silence with a startled expletive. "Oh shit, WTF?" His reaction was immediate, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I stood up, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. About 100 feet away across the graveyard, I saw her, a very old woman dressed in a white, tattered nightgown. Her presence was eerie, and she began speaking directly to us. Her eyes were hollow and her movements were slow, almost mechanical, as if she were moving through water. "Sir, get over here now. I need help." We all froze, not knowing how to react. What struck me was her use of the singular "sir," despite there being 5 of us present. It felt oddly personal and out of place. She started moving towards us, her steps unsteady yet determined. Her voice grew louder as she approached, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The gravel beneath her feet crunched softly, each step echoing in the quiet night. "Boys, I need your help now!" The shift from "sir" to "boys" was jarring. It suggested a plurality that didn't match our group. Her demeanor changed. Her tone became more urgent and frantic. Her eyes darted around nervously, and there was a palpable sense of desperation in her voice. Then, without warning, she began running towards us, her movements erratic and desperate. The nonsense she was screaming didn't make sense, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Her nightgown billowed behind her as she sprinted, an almost spectral figure against the dark backdrop of the graveyard. Panic set in immediately. We all bolted towards the car, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The old woman was close behind us, her footsteps pounding on the gravel path. When we reached the car, a small 2-door sedan, everyone jumped in except me. The driver, Tom, didn't hesitate. He was already seated, blocking my entry to the back seat. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear as he glanced back towards the approaching figure. I yelled as I approached the car, pleading for him to let me in. Tom glanced back, saw the fear on my face, and quickly opened the door for me. The doors slammed shut just as we sped down the narrow graveyard roads, the old woman still visible in our rearview mirror. Her silhouette grew smaller, but her presence felt overwhelmingly close, as if she were reaching out from our past into our present. This is where shit got weird. We reached the other side of the graveyard in what felt like mere seconds. The car was moving swiftly toward the exit, the headlights illuminating the path ahead. As we approached a curved road that was well lit, I glanced back and saw her again. The old woman had run onto the road, her figure barely visible in the headlights. It was impossible for her to have reached that far so quickly. The ground seemed to blur beneath her as she chased us, her breaths heavy and ragged. She was chasing us, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. I could see her trying to keep up, her desperation evident. Her eyes never left the car, fixed with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Finally, she let out a scream that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just a scream. It sounded like she was enduring immense pain, as if she was being tortured slowly and painfully. The noise was so intense that it seemed to shake the very air around us, a haunting melody that echoed in the confined space of the car. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. The car accelerated, tires screeching slightly as we took the exit. The engine roared as we sped away, the old woman becoming nothing but a dark silhouette in our mirrors. The rest of the drive was tense, with everyone too shaken to speak. The once familiar roads now felt foreign and unsafe, each turn and intersection amplifying the tension in the air. Once we were safely on the main road, the reality of what we had just experienced began to sink in. After that night, none of us ever returned to that graveyard. The memory of the old woman's plea and her terrifying scream stayed with me. It was the most unnerving experience of my life, one that none of us could fully explain. Story number 2. When I was around 18, I found myself in the role of the primary caregiver for my younger brother, who was just 2 or 3 years old at the time. He was barely talking yet, full of boundless energy and innocent curiosity. Our home was a typical suburban house with a cozy playroom downstairs, a brightly lit area filled with colorful blocks and toys that seemed to mesmerize him endlessly. On that particular evening, we were in his playroom, engrossed in a game of building towers with blocks, when something unsettling happened that would forever change my perception of our home. We were both in high spirits, my brother giggling and running around, his laughter echoing through the room. The light from the large windows cast cheerful patterns on the floor, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere. Suddenly, the room shifted. My brother went from being the picture of joy to being completely frozen, his eyes locked onto the entryway of the room. His tiny body stood still, a stark contrast to his usual animated movements. Concerned, I approached him, kneeling down to his level. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked gently, trying to coax him out of his trance. Instead of responding verbally, he pointed towards our staircase and uttered the phrase, "Icky noise." His words sent a chill down my spine, not because of what he said, but because of the intensity in his eyes. For a while now, he'd been pointing and saying that phrase, and I had always dismissed it as another one of his playful expressions. But today felt different. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I glanced toward the staircase. Our home's design meant that the staircase was mostly surrounded by walls, casting long shadows that made it difficult to see clearly. At first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary. However, as I focused more intently, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Just below where the wall ended, there was a pitch-black shape of a person crouched on the step. It was a slightly fuzzy silhouette, almost like a shadow given form, staring intently at us through the handrail. My heart raced as I took a step closer, trying to process what I was seeing. The figure remained still for a moment, then took another step down towards us, still holding on to the railing. My mind struggled to comprehend the sight before me. Was it a trick of the light? My brother had never pointed out anything like this before, and there was no logical explanation for its presence. Before I could gather my thoughts, panic surged through me. "What is that?" I screamed, the fear in my voice matching the terror in my heart. Instinctively, I grabbed my brother, pulling him close, and we bolted out of the house as fast as our legs could carry us. The adrenaline-fueled escape took us to the backyard, where we sat huddled together, playing with my sister's dog to calm our nerves. My mind raced with questions, and without hesitation, I called my mom, needing her to come home and explain what we had just witnessed. In the days that followed, the sightings of that ominous figure only seemed to intensify before we decided to move out of the house altogether. My brother, as he grew older and more articulate, began to provide more insight into what he was experiencing. He explained that whenever the figure appeared, he could hear a disturbing, gurgling, whispering sound. The noise was unpleasant, almost grotesque, adding to the fear it instilled in him. I never heard the sounds myself, but witnessing the figure multiple times shattered my long-held belief that daytime was automatically safe. Our home, once a place of warmth and comfort, became a source of unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that danced on the walls, seemed to hide the same dark silhouette we had seen in the playroom. The atmosphere shifted from inviting to oppressive, making it difficult to find peace even in broad daylight. My brother's fear was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel responsible for his distress. The decision to move was unanimous. We couldn't continue living in a place that felt haunted by an unseen presence. Looking back, I realize how deeply that experience affected both of us. The dark silhouette never followed us to the new home, but the fear it instilled was a lingering shadow in our minds. We sought solace in our daily routines, hoping to bury the memories of the playroom in its mysterious occupant. Story number 3. When I was about 13, my 2 buddies and I decided to explore the trails through the woods near my house. We were typical teenagers, seeking adventure and a break from the monotony of school. Our town was surrounded by dense forests, home to numerous urban legends that fueled our curiosity about the paranormal. One afternoon, we set out to hike along our usual trails. After walking for a while, we chose to stray off the path and delve deeper into the forest. It wasn't too far. Within an hour's walk, we'd still find a road. But the allure of the unknown was irresistible. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees and creating an eerie ambiance that heightened our sense of adventure. After about an hour of wandering, we stumbled upon an abandoned shack. It resembled a garage, isolated in the middle of the woods with no visible path leading to it. The discovery was odd. None of us had ever seen or heard about it before, despite frequenting these trails for years. The shack stood out starkly against the natural backdrop, its dilapidated exterior hinting at years of neglect. Driven by teenage bravado, we decided to investigate. We approached the shack cautiously, the wooden planks creaking under our weight as we pushed the door open. Inside, we found an old boat, surprisingly equipped with a brand new engine on the back. A bizarre sight with no logical explanation for its presence here. The shack was cluttered, with 2 to 3 feet of junk covering most of the floor, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Broken furniture, discarded tools, and various random items were strewn about, creating a labyrinth of obstacles that made navigation difficult. Despite the creepiness, our curiosity kept us exploring. The shack had a second level, also buried under piles of debris. As we climbed the rickety stairs, the air grew colder, and the silence was almost palpable. The second level revealed more clutter, old newspapers, rusty nails, and remnants of what seemed to be past projects. The presence of the new engine on the boat remained unexplained, making us wonder who had left it there and why. As the minutes passed, our initial excitement faded, replaced by unease. The darkness seemed to press in around us, and the silence was oppressive. Flickering shadows danced on the walls as the light from our flashlights struggled to penetrate the gloom. Deciding we'd had enough, we chose to leave, feeling a sense of foreboding that something wasn't quite right. The situation took a strange turn. Knowing that any direction we walked would eventually lead us to a road, we hesitated about the long trek back to our house. We couldn't remember the exact trail to take, and exhaustion was setting in. Thankfully, we had walkie-talkies with us, a tool we mostly used for practical jokes. As we fumbled with the channel selectors, trying to find a clear frequency, we realized we'd accidentally all been on the same channel. Suddenly, the crackling sound of a woman sobbing filled our earpieces. Her cries were heavy, interspersed with mutterings, but we couldn't decipher her words. Instantly alarmed, we regrouped to confirm if the others were hearing the same thing. It was indeed coming through all our walkie-talkies simultaneously. We spent about 45 minutes trying to communicate with her, asking if she was okay and what was wrong. Each time, only her sobbing responded. The emotional weight of her cries added a layer of dread to our already tense situation. At one point, another channel picked up the same distressing sounds, suggesting that the woman's presence was pervasive and not limited to just one frequency. We decided to press our luck, hoping to reach her, but her sobs remained unresponsive. The lack of a coherent reply only heightened our fear, making us question if we were dealing with something supernatural. After half an hour of futile attempts, the channels went silent, leaving us more unnerved than before. The abrupt cessation of her cries felt like a warning, intensifying the eerie atmosphere surrounding us. Finally, we managed to find our way out of the trails, but the entire journey back was tense. The lingering fear from the mysterious shack and the woman's cries kept us on edge. The once familiar paths now seemed unfamiliar, twisted by our anxiety and the unsettling experience we had just endured. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig amplified our paranoia, making us hyper-aware of every sound in the woods. None of us could shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows of the forest. We also never heard of any reports of missing or injured people in the area. Our minds raced with possibilities. Had we encountered a ghostly presence, or was it something else entirely? The lack of explanations left us with more questions than answers. Story number 4. As a land surveyor in North Georgia, I've spent countless hours traversing remote wilderness areas. The mountains hold secrets in their ancient folds, everything from forgotten homesteads to old mining operations. But one particular summer afternoon showed me there are some things in those woods that defy explanation. I was working with Mike, my supervisor of 5 years, on a property survey deep in the foothills. The project was routine, marking boundary lines for a development company planning to build vacation homes. We'd started early that morning, working our way through dense undergrowth and around massive oak trees that had stood sentinel for centuries. The humidity wrapped around us like a heavy blanket, and our shirts were soaked through with sweat as we navigated the steep terrain with our equipment. The first subtle shift came around 2 in the afternoon. We'd been working in comfortable silence, the kind that develops between people who've spent years in each other's company. The woods around us were alive with typical mountain sounds, the rhythmic buzzing of cicadas, the hollow knock of woodpeckers, and the constant rustle of small animals moving through the leaf litter. I was focused on taking measurements while Mike checked coordinates on our GPS unit. Then everything changed. The transition was so gradual that I didn't notice it at first, the way you might not notice a cloud passing over the sun until you suddenly realize you're in shadow. But something made me pause and lift my head from the transit level. The cicadas had fallen silent. No birds called. Even the ever-present whisper of wind through the trees had died away, leaving us in a bubble of absolute stillness. I glanced at Mike, finding him already looking in my direction. In 15 years of surveying, I'd never seen him unsettled, but there was something in his expression now that made my skin prickle. We both knew what silence in the woods usually meant: predator. But this felt different. This silence had weight to it, like the air itself was holding its breath. The second strange occurrence came as we continued working, trying to maintain professional composure despite our growing unease. Whispers began to drift through the unnatural quiet, not the sound of wind through leaves or branches creaking, but distinct whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They were too faint to make out words, but they carried urgency in their tone. Mike and I exchanged another look, both realizing the other was hearing the same thing. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind countless times. We were moving forward, checking our line, when a voice cut through the silence, clear as a bell and heavy with authority. "Stop!" The word didn't echo like a human shout would have. Instead, it seemed to drop into the silence like a stone into still water. We froze mid-step, survey equipment still in hand, neither of us having spoken. That's when we saw them. In the dense undergrowth just ahead, partially obscured by moss and thyme, were the distinctive shapes of burial stones. We counted 4 immediately visible markers, their rough surfaces worn by centuries of mountain weather. These weren't the typical cemetery headstones you might find in abandoned family plots scattered through the mountains. These were clearly Native American burial markers, the kind that most surveyors in this region know to watch for, but rarely find. We stood motionless for several long moments, the weight of what had just happened settling over us. If we had continued on our planned path, we would have walked directly across these graves. In all my years of surveying, I'd never experienced anything like this. A warning so clear and undeniable that it couldn't be rationalized away. With unspoken agreement, we carefully backed away from the site, marking it on our GPS and in our notebooks. As we packed up our equipment and headed back to the truck, the forest gradually came back to life around us. First a single bird call, then another, until the familiar symphony of mountain sounds returned in full force. The oppressive silence lifted as if it had never existed. We modified our survey lines to give the burial site a wide berth, returning several days later to complete the project without incident. The developers were notified about the discovery, and the site was properly documented and protected. Story number 5. During childhood summers in Texas, family reunions meant enduring sweltering heat and endless conversations with relatives you barely knew. But our gathering at the ranch venue along the Guadalupe River proved to be memorable for entirely different reasons. The property, despite being established in the late 1970s, carried the gravitas of a much older place. The limestone buildings seemed to have absorbed decades more history than their relatively young age would suggest, their walls radiating an almost palpable sense of accumulated time. My first brush with something inexplicable came on our first morning there. While most of our extended family was settling into their rooms or unpacking coolers for the weekend, I heard the unmistakable sounds of children playing upstairs in the main lodge. The rapid patter of small feet and the rise and fall of young voices filtered down through the ceiling. Nothing unusual for a family gathering, except for one crucial detail. My brother and I were the only children there, and he was outside with our cousins who had just arrived. The sounds were so clear, so normal-seeming, that I felt compelled to investigate. The wooden stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed to the second floor, each step releasing that distinct old wood groan that seems universal to rural Texas buildings. Sunlight streamed through dust-film windows, creating long shadows in the empty hallway, and the air held that distinct mustiness common to spaces that are only occasionally occupied. But now there was only silence. I checked each room methodically, expecting to find some explanation for the sounds. Perhaps younger cousins I hadn't known were coming. Every room stood vacant, beds neatly made, floors silent under my cautious steps. Even the bathroom at the end of the hall was empty, its door slightly ajar and squeaking softly in the breeze from a partially open window. That inspection left me so unsettled that I refused to return upstairs until bedtime, when my parents insisted. The second incident was more direct, more difficult to rationalize away. Later that afternoon, while everyone else was down at the river, I opted to stay behind at the old playground. It was a typical ranch play area, metal slides that burned in the Texas sun, those antiquated spring-mounted horses that seemed designed to induce whiplash, and an old-fashioned merry-go-round that voiced its age through creaks and groans. I was sitting on that merry-go-round, watching distant figures splashing in the river, when I heard the first footsteps. The sound came from behind me, soft steps in grass, quick and light with the short stride of a child. The afternoon heat was intense, causing waves to rise from the metal playground equipment, and cicadas droned steadily in the surrounding trees. When I turned to look, the playground stood empty, baking in the afternoon sun. The spring horses swayed slightly in the hot breeze, their metal joints releasing occasional squeaks that only emphasized the emptiness of the space. I tried to dismiss it, focusing instead on the distant laughter drifting up from the river, where I could see my family's colorful towels spread along the riverbank. But within minutes, the footsteps returned. This time they were running directly toward me, the sound changing distinctly as they crossed from grass onto playground mulch. The mulch shifted and crunched with each invisible step, leaving small indentations that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Before I could process what was happening, the merry-go-round shuddered beneath me. Metal rang out with clear, rhythmic clangs, the unmistakable sound of small shoes running across its surface. Pure instinct took over. I launched myself off the platform and ran, heart thundering against my ribs. In my panic, I felt something catch the back of my shoe with enough force to stop it completely. My foot pulled free and I kept running, leaving the shoe behind, tears streaming down my face as I fled toward the river and the safety of family. My mother's skepticism was perhaps the most painful part of the experience. She insisted I return to retrieve my abandoned shoe, practically dragging me back to the playground. By then, everything was still and silent, my shoe lying exactly where it had been stopped by something I couldn't explain. The final encounter came the next morning. I was alone in the top bunk, my brother having already gone down for breakfast. The familiar sound of small footsteps in the hallway froze me in place. As I moved to climb down, the ladder began to shake and thump rhythmically, as if invisible feet were ascending toward me. The movement was so real, so present, that I abandoned the ladder entirely, leaping from the top bunk and sprinting downstairs without looking back. Years later, I returned to the ranch with a college friend. The property had been extensively modernized. New buildings dotted the grounds, facilities had been updated, and fresh paint covered the limestone walls. But that playground remained, its metal structures still standing sentinel in the Texas sun. Story number 6. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal. Ghost hunting shows, spirit photography, psychic mediums, it all seemed like entertainment designed to prey on people's willingness to believe. Even after years of friends trying to convince me with their personal ghost stories, I remained firmly rooted in my conviction that everything had a logical explanation. Science, physics, and rational thinking were my foundations, and I took pride in being the person who could explain away the supposedly unexplainable. This made my relationship with my coworker Sarah somewhat awkward when she started talking about the portal in her house where spirits supposedly traveled. Sarah wasn't some gullible believer. She was our resident pragmatist, the one who could spot accounting errors at a glance and resolve inventory discrepancies in seconds. Her mental math skills were legendary among the staff, and she approached everything with careful logic and attention to detail. Her matter-of-fact descriptions of spiritual visitors made me uncomfortable, though I tried to hide it. I'd nod politely during these conversations while mentally filing them away as proof that even the most logical people could have bizarre beliefs. One slow Wednesday afternoon, I had my son Tyler with me at work. The store was empty except for the three of us, the quiet broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beep from Tyler's handheld game. The building was an older retail space with tall ceilings that made every small sound echo slightly. Our layout featured a horseshoe-shaped counter area that created a closed circuit. To get from one side to the other, you had to walk all the way around, passing directly by the register where I stood. The design made it easy to track customer movement and prevent shoplifting, as there was no way to get from one side to the other without being seen. While organizing receipts and running end-of-day reports, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. To my right, between two aisles of merchandise, I saw a small boy about Tyler's height passing through. The child had distinctive blonde hair, and I glimpsed light-colored clothing, what looked like a pale blue shirt and khaki shorts, as he moved between the shelves. The lighting in that section was particularly good, as we'd just replaced several bulbs the day before, so the image was clear despite being brief. Assuming Tyler had gotten bored and wandered off, I called out to ask what he was doing. "Still playing my game," came his immediate response from the complete opposite direction. I turned to find Tyler exactly where he'd been for the past hour, perched on his stool behind the counter to my left, completely absorbed in his game. The distance between where I'd seen the boy and where Tyler sat was substantial, requiring a full circuit around the counter area that would have taken at least 15 seconds at a run. Even if he'd sprinted at full speed, he couldn't have made it from one spot to the other in the split second that had passed. The security mirrors mounted in the corners confirmed what I already knew. There were no other children in the store. Before I could begin constructing a rational explanation, maybe a reflection in the glass doors, perhaps a trick of light from passing cars, Sarah turned to me with an unsettling intensity I'd never seen in her normally calm demeanor. "You just saw him, didn't you?" she asked quietly. "He followed me to work today." Without any prompting from me, she described exactly what I'd seen. A young boy with blonde hair wearing a light blue shirt and khaki shorts, the same height as Tyler. She even mentioned a detail I hadn't consciously registered, that he seemed to be slightly transparent at the edges, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The next morning, I found myself in the local library, poring over old property records and newspapers. After years of explaining away others' ghost stories, I was now searching through microfiche, my hands slightly shaking as I scrolled through decades of history. Sarah watched me from her register when I arrived for my shift that afternoon, but she didn't say a word about her young visitor or my obvious lack of sleep. She just nodded, as if she'd been expecting this all along. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.